Picture this: a vast field of weathered tombstones stretching into the distance, their inscriptions worn smooth by time. The air is thick with the weight of centuries, and beneath the soil lie silent witnesses to battles far beyond the grave. These aren't just resting places for the dead, they're battlegrounds for the living. From the moment humans first laid their loved ones to rest, burial grounds have been more than quiet memorials. They've been stages for power, tools of control, and symbols of who gets to remember and who gets forgotten. Think about the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs carved their legacies into stone, or Arlington National Cemetery, where rows of white markers tell a story of sacrifice and national identity. These spaces weren't chosen by accident. They were designed to send a message, to shape how future generations would see the past. But what happens when these sacred sites become political weapons, when rulers rewrite history by erasing tombs, or when communities fight to reclaim burial grounds that were stolen from them? The answers lie in the shadows of these ancient cemeteries, where every grave holds a secret and every monument tells a lie, or a truth someone tried to bury. This is the untold story of how the dead have been used to control the living. Across civilizations, from Rome to Mesopotamia, from medieval Europe to the Americas, cemeteries have been caught in the crossfire of wars, revolutions, and cultural clashes. They've been moved, destroyed, or glorified, all to serve the agendas of those in power. But beneath the politics, there's a deeper question: who gets to decide what we remember? As we walk through these haunted landscapes, we'll uncover how ancient cemeteries became the ultimate prize in the fight for memory, identity, and control. The journey starts here, in the quietest places where the echoes of history speak the loudest. Consider the pyramids of Egypt, towering monuments that weren't just tombs but declarations of divine right. Pharaohs didn't just build these colossal structures to house their bodies. They used them to cement their godlike status in the minds of the living. The message was clear: even in death, their power was eternal. This wasn't unique to Egypt. Across the ancient world, rulers turned burial grounds into political tools, a practice scholars now call necropolitics, the manipulation of death and memory to control the living. Take the mausoleums of Rome, where emperors like Augustus constructed lavish tombs along the Via Appia, transforming a road of the dead into a parade of imperial glory. These weren't quiet resting places, they were stage sets for propaganda, reminding every citizen who passed by where true authority lay. And then there's Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, who took it a step further. His terracotta army, thousands of life-sized soldiers buried alongside him, wasn't just about protection in the afterlife. It was a show of force, a statement that his dominance would outlast his mortal life. But why go to such lengths? Because controlling how the dead are remembered means controlling how the living see themselves. A grand tomb isn't just about honoring a ruler. It's about rewriting history, erasing rivals, and ensuring future generations accept a certain version of the past. These sites became anchors of identity, tying people to a ruler's legacy, a dynasty's claim, or even a nation's borders. When you bury your heroes in sacred soil, that land becomes yours, not just in practice, but in the collective imagination. This ancient playbook didn't disappear. It set the stage for centuries of conflict over who gets to claim the dead, and by extension, the living. From medieval kings who insisted on burial in conquered lands to modern disputes over repatriating stolen grave goods, the politics of cemeteries never really faded. They just took on new forms, because when you control the past, you hold the keys to the future. and nothing shapes the past quite like where and how we lay the dead to rest. History has shown us that graves are never just graves, they're targets. When conquerors sought to break a people, they didn't just burn cities or topple statues. They went for the cemeteries. Take the Spanish invasion of the Aztec Empire. Under the guise of religious conversion, they demolished sacred burial mounds, scattering bones and building churches directly atop indigenous resting places. This wasn't just destruction, it was a calculated erasure. By wiping away the physical traces of the dead, colonizers aimed to sever the living from their ancestors, their history, even their identity. Without graves to visit, without names carved in stone, how could future generations remember who they were? But resistance often whispered beneath the surface. Across the Americas, indigenous communities risked punishment to secretly tend to ancestral graves hidden in forests or caves. In Peru, some even buried their dead beneath the floors of Spanish-style churches, a quiet act of defiance that kept their loved ones close despite the invaders' rules. These weren't just acts of preservation, they were battles for memory itself. Because when you control where and how the dead are buried, you control the story of a people. The same pattern echoed through medieval Europe, where Jewish cemeteries were routinely vandalized or paved over. In cities like Prague and Worms, tombstones were ripped up to build roads or city walls, a deliberate humiliation meant to strip Jewish communities of their sacred ties to the past. Yet even here, resilience flickered. Some families smuggled fragments of headstones into new burial grounds, reassembling them like puzzles, a testament to the unbroken chain of memory. Today, we're still grappling with these acts of erasure. Archaeologists sift through landfill sites searching for fragments of desecrated headstones. Descendants petition museums to return looted bones. Every repatriated skull, every restored grave marker is a small victory in the long war over who gets to tell history's story. Because cemeteries aren't just about the dead, they're maps of belonging, proof that a people existed, loved, and mattered. And when those maps are torn up, the fight to piece them back together becomes its own kind of rebellion. Digging up the past isn't always about uncovering history. Sometimes it's about rewriting it. Archaeology, especially when it comes to ancient cemeteries, has long been wielded as a political weapon, with bones and artifacts twisted to fit modern agendas. Take Nazi Germany's obsession with Germanic burial sites. Teams of archaeologists, handpicked by the regime, scoured Europe for ancient graves, not to study them, but to cherry-pick evidence supporting their racist ideology. A Viking-era skeleton became proof of Aryan superiority. A Bronze Age sword was framed as a symbol of Germanic dominance. The Nazis didn't just distort history, they weaponized it, using the dead to justify their vision of a fabricated past. This wasn't an isolated case. Across the globe, ancient graves have been exploited to fuel nationalist myths. In Turkey, excavations of Hittite tombs were used to strengthen ties to a pre-Islamic past. In Israel, debates over ancient Judean burial caves became entangled with modern land claims. Even today, the question of who owns the dead sparks fierce disputes. Look at the battle over Egyptian mummies in Western museums. For centuries, these remains were treated as curiosities, stripped from their tombs and displayed behind glass. Now, Egypt demands their return, arguing these aren't artifacts, they're ancestors, stripped of dignity. The British Museum's reluctance to part with the Rosetta Stone isn't just about preservation, it's about power. Who gets to decide where history stays? The ethical dilemmas pile up like unearthed bones. Archaeologists today walk a tightrope between science and politics. When Greece demands the Elgin marbles back from London, it's not just about marble, it's about healing centuries of colonial wounds. but what happens when repatriation clashes with preservation? Some argue museums protect fragile artifacts from looting or decay. Others counter that keeping them abroad perpetuates historical theft. There are no easy answers, only uneasy compromises. And then there's the darker side, the black market. Looted graves feed a multi-billion-dollar antiquities trade, where stolen skulls and sacred relics end up in private collections, erased from their cultural context. Every time a tomb is raided, a piece of humanity's story vanishes. Archaeologists now race against time and greed to document vulnerable sites before they're lost forever. The truth is, cemeteries are more than resting places. They're mirrors reflecting how societies choose to remember or erase their past. When politics digs its claws into archaeology, the stakes aren't just academic. They're about identity, justice, and who controls the narrative, because whoever holds the bones holds the story, and in that struggle, the dead become the most powerful pawns of all. In Jerusalem, where every stone tells a story, the dead have become silent witnesses to centuries of religious strife. The city's ancient cemeteries, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, aren't just burial grounds, they're battlegrounds for sacred geography. Take the Mount of Olives, a sprawling Jewish cemetery dating back 3,000 years. For generations, it's been a target. Tombstones have been smashed, graves desecrated, all because their very presence is seen as a claim to the land. On the other side of the city, Muslim shrines face similar threats. The Mamilla Cemetery, one of Islam's oldest, has seen sections bulldozed for construction projects, a physical erasure that fuels deeper tensions. These aren't random acts of vandalism. They're calculated moves in a high-stakes game where graves serve as proof of historical presence and, by extension, territorial rights. The pattern repeats globally. In India, the Babri Masjid site became a flashpoint when Hindu nationalists claimed it stood atop the birthplace of Lord Rama, sparking riots that left thousands dead. In the Balkans, medieval Orthodox Christian graves were systematically destroyed during the Yugoslav wars, a brutal effort to rewrite ethnic and religious maps. Even Sufi shrines, once bridges between faiths, have been reduced to rubble by extremist groups. When militants dynamite the tomb of a 13th century mystic in Mali or Libya, they're not just attacking a building, they're trying to erase centuries of pluralistic tradition. These sites represent a dangerous idea to fundamentalists, that different faiths once coexisted, even revered the same holy figures. But history also offers quieter counterpoints. In medieval Spain, under Muslim rule, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim graves often stood side by side in what scholars call convivencia cemeteries. In Sarajevo, a single hill holds Ottoman-era Muslim tombstones and Austro-Hungarian Catholic crosses, their proximity a testament to shared space. These rare examples prove burial grounds don't have to be symbols of division. They can become places of uneasy truce, where the dead remind the living of what they once had in common. Today's courts grapple with these legacies. In Cyprus, Greek and Turkish communities fight legal battles over repatriating bones displaced during the 1970s conflict. In Israel, lawsuits demand protection for Palestinian Semites amid settlement expansions. Judges weigh archaeological evidence against contemporary claims, but no ruling can fully untangle faith from politics. Because when sacred soil is at stake, the past is never just the past. It's a weapon, a shield, and a mirror reflecting who we are now. The question isn't just who gets to bury their dead, but who gets to decide what those graves mean for the living. The 19th century saw a macabre kind of gold rush, not for precious metals but for human bones. European collectors, armed with shovels and a sense of entitlement, descended on indigenous grave sites across the globe, treating sacred burial grounds as little more than open-air museums. In North America, they ransacked Native American mounds, shipping skulls and artifacts back to London, Berlin, and Paris as macabre trophies. Halfway around the world, the same scene played out in New Zealand, where Maori Yoruba sacred burial caves were pillaged, their tupuna or ancestors displayed in glass cases like biological specimens. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic erasure, a way to strip colonized peoples of their history while propping up racist pseudoscience. Phrenologists measured stolen skulls to prove white superiority. Museums catalogued bones under dehumanizing labels like specimen number 304. The message was clear: to the conquerors, these weren't ancestors, they were data. For indigenous communities, the trauma was visceral. Imagine learning your great-grandmother's bones were locked in a university basement, her identity reduced to a handwritten tag. In Australia, Aboriginal families have spent decades fighting for the return of stolen remains, often against institutional resistance. Museums argued these bones were scientifically invaluable, as if centuries of oral tradition counted for nothing. The turning point came with the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, which forced American institutions to return human remains and sacred objects. But progress has been agonizingly slow. Some institutions dragged their feet for years, demanding impossible levels of proof. Others still cling to looted relics under the guise of global heritage. Few cases reveal this tension more starkly than the battle over Kennewick Man. When a 9,000-year-old skeleton was found in Washington state in 1996, scientists and native tribes clashed in court for over a decade. Researchers insisted the bones belonged to science, while the Umatilla Nation countered that he was their ancestor, deserving of reburial. The courts initially sided with science until DNA testing proved the tribe right. It was a bittersweet victory, exposing how legal systems privilege Western notions of evidence over indigenous knowledge. Now, technology is flipping the script. Ground-penetrating radar helps locate unmarked graves at residential schools. Facial reconstruction software puts human faces on skulls languishing in museum storage. Digital archives compile stolen artifacts, creating virtual reunions for displaced heritage. In New Zealand, 3D printing allows Maori to replicate stolen carvings, bridging the gap until originals are returned. These tools aren't just about recovery, they're about justice. Because every skull reburied, every ceremony finally performed, is a step toward healing the wounds colonialism left in the earth. The dead may be silent, but their return speaks volumes about who we choose to honor and who we've too long ignored. Reburial ceremonies are more than rituals, they're acts of resurrection for stories long silenced. When the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre recovered the remains of their ancestors from museums in 2011, the moment wasn't just about returning bones to soil. Elders wrapped the fragile skeletons in kangaroo skins, singing the same lullabies their great-grandmothers might have hummed centuries earlier. This was history breathing again. Across the globe, similar scenes unfold as grassroots movements transform museum basements into sites of homecoming. In Hawaii, iwi kupuna sacred ancestral bones are greeted with chants as they're reinterred in lava tubes. In Canada, First Nations communities hold candlelit vigils for children whose remains were finally identified at residential school sites. These moments carry a quiet power that transcends politics. They're about stitching torn connections, about telling the dead, "We never forgot you." Legal frameworks like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act have become tools for justice, but their impact depends on who wields them. NAGPRA, passed in 1990, forced American institutions to inventory human remains, yet 30 years later, over 100,000 native bones still sit in storage. The loopholes are telling. Institutions can delay repatriation by demanding tribes prove cultural affiliation, a near impossible task when colonial records are spotty or deliberately erased. Some museums even classified skulls as unidentifiable to avoid returning them. But tribes are turning the tables. The Saginaw Chippewa used NAGPRA to reclaim 2,000 ancestors from the University of Michigan, while the Pawnee Nation employed forensic anthropologists to match 19th-century excavation records with stolen remains. Every victory sets a precedent, proving that persistence can rewrite the rules. Science has become an unlikely ally in this reckoning. DNA analysis, once used to justify racist hierarchies, now helps mend their damage. In Sweden, genetic testing confirmed that a museum's unclassified skeleton belonged to the Sami people, triggering its return under Nordic repatriation laws. In Australia, isotopic analysis traced stolen Torres Strait Islander bones back to their home islands using mineral signatures in the teeth, but technology has its limits. Many tribes reject DNA testing as a violation of spiritual beliefs, forcing institutions to respect oral histories as valid evidence. The tension reveals a deeper shift. Archaeology can no longer treat bones as mere data. Their kin, this movement is shaking the foundations of traditional archaeology. Universities that once taught excavation as neutral science now grapple with uncomfortable questions. Who decides what counts as research versus desecration? Why do some graves get studied while others, like European medieval cemeteries, remain undisturbed? Younger archaeologists increasingly partner with indigenous communities, treating digs as collaborations rather than conquests. At the University of British Columbia, students learn to carry eagle feathers during excavations to honor spirits. In New Mexico, Pueblo leaders now oversee digs on ancestral lands, deciding which artifacts stay buried. It's a slow revolution, one that recognizes excavation isn't just about uncovering the past, it's about who has the right to interpret it. The ripple effects reach beyond reburials. Museums face growing pressure to return not just bones but sacred objects, everything from Hopi Kachina dolls to Maori tattooed heads. The British Museum's refusal to surrender Benin bronzes looted from Nigeria in 1897 has sparked protests worldwide. But change is creeping in. Germany recently began returning Benin artifacts, while France repatriated 26 Dahomey treasures to Benin. Each restitution carries symbolic weight, proving that stolen history can find its way home. These movements aren't just correcting old wrongs, they're redrawing the moral map of archaeology, where ethics matter as much as discoveries, because true restoration isn't about digging deeper. It's about listening harder to the voices we've spent centuries ignoring. Cities expand like living organisms, their concrete roots pushing deeper into the earth, often right through the bones of those who came before. In London, construction crews digging for a new subway line unearthed a mass grave from the Black Death, skeletons stacked like firewood beneath the bustling streets of the 21st century. Workers paused, but only briefly. The bones were photographed, boxed, and hauled away. The tunnel project rolled forward. This collision between progress and preservation plays out in nearly every metropolis. Ancient cemeteries lie beneath our feet, silent casualties of urban sprawl, their stories paved over in the name of development. New York's African burial ground is a stark reminder of what's at stake. In 1991, workers excavating a federal building in Lower Manhattan struck hundreds of colonial-era coffins, the forgotten dead of enslaved Africans. For 2 centuries, their existence had been erased by city grids and racist indifference. Activists fought for years to halt construction, eventually forcing the government to redesign the project around the sacred site. Today, a memorial stands where office towers were planned, its spiraling stone paths echoing the cycle of remembrance and resistance. But this victory was rare. Countless other burial grounds vanish under parking lots and shopping malls, their histories bulldozed before anyone can protest. The legal battles reveal uncomfortable truths. Zoning laws often treat cemeteries as obstacles rather than heritage. In Nashville, developers fought to build a luxury condo complex atop a 19th-century black cemetery, arguing the graves were too degraded to warrant protection. In Mississippi, a Walmart was constructed over Chickasaw burial mounds after a rushed archaeological survey dismissed their significance. These aren't accidents, they're choices. When cities prioritize tax revenue over sacred ground, they send a message about whose ancestors matter. Yet grassroots movements are rewriting the script. In Tulsa, descendants of the 1921 race massacre successfully campaigned to halt a highway expansion threatening potential mass graves. Using ground-penetrating radar, they proved what oral history had long claimed, that victims were buried in unmarked trenches. Technology has become a game-changer, allowing activists to map endangered sites before the bulldozers arrive. Digital preservation offers another lifeline. Teams now use 3D scanning to create virtual replicas of cemeteries slated for demolition, ensuring that even if the physical site is lost, its memory survives in pixels and polygons. The tension between growth and graves won't disappear, but the question isn't whether we can build, it's whether we can build without erasing. Every time a city chooses to reroute a road or redesign a plaza to protect the dead, it does more than preserve bones. It acknowledges that progress shouldn't come at the cost of forgetting who paved the way. When ISIS bulldozed the ancient tombs of Palmyra, they didn't just destroy stone, they erased a bridge between past and present. But in the digital age, even rubble can tell a story. Archaeologists armed with 3D scanners had already documented the site, capturing every carved rose and weathered epitaph in intricate detail. Now, those scans form the backbone of virtual reconstructions, allowing anyone with a headset to walk through Palmyra's necropolis as it once stood. This isn't just preservation, it's defiance. The Million Image Database, a global initiative, has catalogued thousands of at-risk heritage sites using photogrammetry, creating digital blueprints in case the originals vanish. From Syrian temples to Haitian cemeteries damaged by earthquakes, these virtual twins offer a fragile kind of immortality. For diasporas separated from ancestral lands by borders or conflict, technology provides a poignant substitute. Chinese families scattered by migration can now burn virtual offerings at digitized Qing dynasty graves through apps like Ancestral Cloud. Ukrainian refugees light candles on interactive maps marking the GPS coordinates of family plots back home. These platforms don't just replicate tradition, they reinvent it, turning smartphones into portals for grief and connection. But the ethical lines blur quickly. When a Holocaust memorial app monetizes access to concentration camp burial sites, or when a startup sells NFT headstones, critics ask, are we honoring memory or commodifying it? The debate rages in academic circles where some argue digitization sanitizes the visceral reality of death, while others hail it as democratization, giving voice to communities whose physical memorials were destroyed. Forensic archaeologists walk an even finer line. In Argentina, facial reconstruction software has put names to the skeletal remains of dictatorship victims dumped in mass graves. In Rwanda, 3D models of genocide sites serve as evidence in international courts. these tools aren't neutral, they're shaped by the hands that wield them. A mass grave scanned by a government may tell a different story than one documented by grassroots activists. The raw data might be objective, but the interpretation never is. Yet for all its complexities, digital resurrection offers something profound, a chance to outrun oblivion. When Notre Dame burned in 2019, gamers realized Assassin's Creed's meticulously rendered cathedral could guide restorers. Similarly, the skeletal scans of Pompeii's eruption victims, once locked in academic databases, now allow schoolchildren to meet a Roman baker frozen in time. The dead may not speak, but technology is learning to listen, and in doing so, it's rewriting the rules of remembrance. The question isn't whether we should digitize the past, but who gets to control how it's reborn. The skeletons of the Battle of Toten don't just lie in the ground, they speak. Unearthed from a quiet English field, these bones from the Wars of the Roses tell a brutal story. Forensic analysis reveals fractures consistent with medieval poleaxes, spinal injuries from execution-style blows, even the teeth marks of scavenging animals. But what's most striking isn't the violence, it's how these remains rewrite history. Chroniclers of the time described Toten as a noble clash of kings, yet the bones paint a grimmer picture. Mass graves filled with teenage conscripts and malnourished peasants, their bodies heaped without ceremony. This is the paradox of forensic archaeology. The dead become witnesses, their silent testimony dismantling centuries of myth. Pompeii's plaster casts offer another layer of ethical complexity. When archaeologists poured gypsum into voids left by decomposed bodies, they preserved haunting snapshots of final moments: a child curled beside a parent, a man shielding his face. These figures draw millions of visitors, but should they? Critics argue turning tragic deaths into museum displays crosses a line, reducing real suffering to spectacle. Supporters counter that the casts humanize history, making distant catastrophes visceral. The debate echoes in places like Peru's Lemabamba Museum, where Inca mummies sit upright behind glass, their fingernails still intact. Where's the boundary between education and exploitation? Some institutions now adopt compromise practices, displaying replicas while storing originals respectfully, or letting descendant communities dictate terms. Then there's DNA, the ultimate disruptor of historical narratives. When geneticists tested bones from Viking-era cemeteries in Britain, they found surprises. Many Viking burials contained locals with Scandinavian-style grave goods, while some actual Norse settlers were buried without fanfare. The findings appended stereotypes, proving identity wasn't always tied to bloodlines. But this science cuts both ways. In Spain, genetic analysis of Franco-era mass graves has helped families identify loved ones executed during the dictatorship, a bittersweet closure. Meanwhile, far-right groups cherry-pick ancestry studies to fuel nationalist myths, twisting haplogroups into political weapons. Ownership gets murkier with every breakthrough. When researchers extracted DNA from 7,000-year-old skeletons in Spain, they faced an unexpected dilemma. The remains shared genetic markers with modern Basque populations. Suddenly, academic curiosity collided with living identity claims. Indigenous groups from Australia to Alaska now grapple with similar questions. Does shared DNA grant them authority over ancient bones? Some tribes embrace genetic testing to reclaim stolen ancestors. Others reject it as a colonial intrusion, insisting oral traditions carry equal weight. Forensics has become a double-edged sword capable of both justice and erasure. In Guatemala, mass grave exhumations helped prosecute war criminals from the 1980s genocide. In Bosnia, satellite imagery guided investigators to hidden execution sites. Yet for every case solved, others languish in political limbo. Turkey blocks access to suspected Armenian genocide graves. China restricts testing on Uyghur cemeteries. The lesson is clear: bones don't lie, but their stories are only heard if power allows it. As technology advances, so does the urgency to ask who controls the narrative when the dead can finally speak. DNA doesn't just reveal ancestry, it ignites wars over who owns history. The Kennewick Man saga exposed this fault line in stark detail. When scientists sequenced the genome of this 9,000-year-old skeleton found in Washington state, they expected to settle debates about early human migration. Instead, they triggered a legal firestorm. The Umatilla Nation insisted the remains were their ancestor, demanding repatriation under NAGPRA. Researchers countered that the bones predated modern tribes, calling them scientifically invaluable. For years, courts sided with science until DNA proved the tribes right. The case became a cautionary tale. Even the most advanced technology can't strip bones of their cultural meaning. Commercial interests have further muddied these waters. Firms like Ancestry.com and 23andMe profit from our hunger to connect with the past, but their databases rely on contested sources. In Iceland, Decode Genetics mined centuries-old church records to reconstruct family trees without consulting living descendants. In South Africa, companies patented the DNA of the San people, turning sacred genetic markers into profit streams. The backlash was swift. Indigenous groups from Arizona to the Arctic now require stringent consent protocols for genetic research, arguing that DNA isn't just data, it's stolen heritage. The politics of DNA grow even thornier where land claims are at stake. In Israel, genetic studies of ancient Canaanite remains have been weaponized in debates over modern borders. When one study suggested continuity between Bronze Age populations and present-day Palestinians, politicians and activists seized on the findings to support competing narratives. Archaeology here isn't just about the past, it's ammunition for contemporary conflicts. Similar battles rage in the Caucasus, where Armenian and Azerbaijani scholars clash over the genetic origins of medieval grave sites. Every haplogroup becomes a border drawn in blood. Mythology amplifies these tensions. Ireland's Tara Scrine Valley, believed to be the burial place of legendary kings, became a flashpoint when a proposed highway threatened its ancient mounds. Protesters invoked Celtic folklore, framing the site as a living testament to national identity, not just a cluster of old bones. In Japan, imperial tombs shrouded in myth remain strictly off-limits to archaeologists, their secrets guarded by the agency of the imperial household. The message is clear: some stories are too powerful to be unearthed. As DNA analysis grows cheaper and more accessible, these conflicts will only multiply. Forensic tools once confined to labs now fit in backpacks, letting amateur sleuths extract genetic material from unprotected graves. Online databases crowdsource ancestry data, creating virtual cemeteries built on stolen remains. The dead have never been more vulnerable or more vocal. Their genes whisper secrets that can rewrite history books, topple governments, and reunite scattered peoples. But only if we listen to the living who still speak for them. Glastonbury Abbey in the year 1191, workers digging near the high altar strike something unexpected. Beneath their shovels lies a lead cross inscribed in Latin. Here lies buried the renowned King Arthur with his second wife Guinevere in the Isle of Avalon. The news spreads like wildfire. Pilgrims flock to the site, donations pour into the struggling monastery, and England's Plantagenet kings seize the moment. Suddenly, a mythical figure becomes tangible proof of their divine right to rule. There's just one problem: the grave was almost certainly a forgery. Forensic analysis centuries later revealed the skeletal remains were a medieval patchwork, a woman's bones paired with a man's, artfully arranged to fit the legend. This wasn't archaeology, it was political theater. By planting Arthur's tomb on sacred ground, the monks and their royal patrons did more than rewrite history. They weaponized it, turning a cemetery into a stage for power. The Middle Ages brimmed with similar fabrications. In Prague, Emperor Charles IV discovered the lance of Saint Wenceslas just as he needed to legitimize his reign. In Spain, the sudden appearance of St. James's tomb in Santiago de Compostela transformed a backwater into Christendom's third holiest site. These weren't harmless myths. They were territorial claims carved in stone, designed to rally followers and intimidate rivals. Even the dead weren't safe from manipulation, especially when they could be reinvented as supernatural threats. Take the vampire panics that swept Eastern Europe in the 1700s. When crops failed or disease spread, villagers often blamed the restless dead. They'd exhume corpses, searching for signs of undead activity, fresh blood around the mouth, strangely preserved flesh. The cure was brutal: stakes through the heart, decapitation, even burning. But these weren't just superstitions. They reflected deeper societal terrors of plague, of invading armies, of collapsing order. A desecrated grave became a lightning rod for collective anxiety, a way to assert control when the world felt chaotic. Modern politicians still play this game. In the Balkans, nationalist leaders invoke medieval warrior graves to justify modern borders. In India, debates over Babur's supposed tomb fuel Hindu-Muslim tensions. And in Jerusalem, competing claims to David's tomb ignite protests and vandalism. Yet folklore also offers counter-narratives. Japan's Yurei legends, ghost stories about disturbed graves, aren't just entertainment. They're cautionary tales warning against disrespecting the dead. Shrines like Kyoto's Otogi Nenbutsu-ji actively discourage excavation, framing graves as thresholds between worlds that shouldn't be crossed. Nowhere is this tension more visible than in burial tourism. Places like Paris's catacombs or Mexico's Day of the Dead celebrations turn cemeteries into economic engines. But when visitors outnumber mourners, the line between reverence and exploitation blurs. In Romania, Bran Castle markets itself as Dracula's tomb, despite no evidence Vlad the Impaler was buried there. In Egypt, selfie sticks click beside millennia-old mummies, their faces lit by flash photography. The dead have never been so profitable or so powerless to control their own stories. From forged royal tombs to monetized vampire myths, one thread connects them all. Graves aren't just about memory, they're mirrors reflecting what the living fear, desire, or aspire to control. And as long as bones can be spun into legend, the battle over their meaning will never truly rest. 6 million visitors a year descend into Paris's catacombs, their footsteps echoing past walls stacked with femurs and skulls. What began as a solution to overflowing cemeteries in the 1700s has become one of France's top attractions, a macabre playground where tourists snap selfies beside carefully arranged tibias labeled the barrel of legs. The irony is palpable. These bones belonged to ordinary Parisians who never imagined their remains would become a ticket line commodity. Yet here they are, their anonymity traded for €15 admission fees. This isn't unique to Paris. From Mexico's vibrant Day of the Dead parades to Egypt's floodlit tombs in the Valley of the Kings, sacred spaces have become economic lifelines. But when does reverence tip into exploitation? Take Luxor's sprawling necropolis, where cruise ships disgorge thousands daily to gawk at Tutankhamun's gilded sarcophagus. The humidity from tourists' breath accelerates paint deterioration in 3,000-year-old tombs, forcing authorities to rotate access like a fragile museum exhibit. Local guides whisper that some officials prioritize revenue over preservation, keeping controversial sites like Akhenaten's erased legacy off limits to avoid complicating Egypt's pharaonic brand. The tension is glaring. These aren't just archaeological wonders, they're someone's ancestors, stripped of context and repackaged for mass consumption. Yet alternative models exist. In New Zealand's North Island, Maori iwi lead small group tours to sacred Yorupa, or burial grounds. Visitors don't wander freely. They're taught proper protocols: no touching, no photos, leaving offerings of greenery. The experience isn't about spectacle but connection, with elders sharing stories that contextualize each carved figure. Similar initiatives thrive in Hawaii, where native guides at Oahu's Kauaiahau Church Cemetery explain how missionary pressures forced indigenous burial practices underground. These tours flip the script, proving tourism doesn't have to mean extraction, it can be exchange. The line blurs at atrocity sites. Cambodia's Choang Ek killing fields, where glass cases display victims' clothing and bone fragments, walk a tightrope between education and voyeurism. Some survivors argue the displays honor the dead. Others resent their trauma becoming a bucket list stop for dark tourists. The same debate simmers at Auschwitz, where influencers posing on train tracks sparked outrage. These aren't just graves, they're crime scenes, demanding a sensitivity that souvenir shops and snack bars inherently undermine. Governments amplify these contradictions for political ends. China's state-sponsored Red Tourism routes steer visitors to revolutionary martyrs' cemeteries, framing Communist Party history as sacred narrative. In Turkey, restored Ottoman graves in Kosovo serve as soft power tools, reinforcing claims of historical influence. Even Rome's catacombs, once hidden Christian refuges, now feature in Vatican-led pilgrimages that conflate faith with cultural dominance. The truth is, grave tourism mirrors our fractured relationship with mortality, equal parts fascination and avoidance. We flock to tombs seeking connection to the past, yet often reduce their inhabitants to props in our own stories. But when done right, these visits can become acts of witness, acknowledging that every skull in a catacomb, every name on a genocide memorial, was once a person who laughed, loved, and deserved to be remembered on their own terms. The challenge isn't just preserving bones, it's honoring the humanity they represent. Walk through Moscow's Alexander Garden, and you'll find a flame that never dies. The tomb of the unknown soldier, guarded by stoic soldiers in precise synchrony, isn't just a memorial, it's a stage. Every flicker of that eternal fire reinforces a narrative. Sacrifice for the motherland is sacred, unquestionable. This is state-sponsored memory at its most potent. Soviet planners didn't place this monument by accident. They positioned it beneath the Kremlin walls, weaving it into the fabric of national identity. The message is clear: loyalty to the state is as timeless as the dead themselves. Across Russia, similar war memorials repeat the theme, their grandeur designed to eclipse uncomfortable questions. What about the soldiers shot for retreating, the millions starved in sieges? Those stories don't get marble or eternal flames. They vanish into unmarked trenches. China offers a starker contrast. Beneath the manicured lawns of Beijing's Babayoshan Revolutionary Cemetery lie Communist Party elites, their tombs polished and revered. Just a few miles away, the names of those who fell in Tiananmen Square in 1989 are scrubbed from public record. Families whisper about ashes dumped in remote fields, graves dug under cover of darkness. This duality defines authoritarian memory politics. Amplify the correct dead, erase the inconvenient ones. Even in death, you serve the state either as a hero or a ghost. America's Arlington Cemetery reveals how democracies navigate this tension. The rolling hills of Virginia hold both triumph and reckoning. Section 60, where Vietnam veterans rest, was once shunned by visitors. Now it's a pilgrimage site. The African American Civil War Memorial, added in 1997, corrects generations of exclusion. These shifts mirror national identity crises: who qualifies as a hero and who decides. For decades, Confederate graves at Arlington flew rebel flags until public outcry forced their removal. Even hallowed ground isn't immune to cultural battles. But grassroots memorials push back. In Chile's Patio 29, families of Pinochet's victims planted crosses where the regime buried disappeared prisoners as unknowns. In Belarus, protesters turn random sidewalks into flower-strewn shrines for murdered activists, knowing official cemeteries will never honor them. These acts reclaim memory from the powerful, proving that while states may control monuments, they don't monopolize grief. A single candle lit at an unmarked grave can be as revolutionary as a statue toppling, because it dares to say, "This life mattered," even if the world pretends otherwise. In the shadow of official monuments, something quieter but no less powerful takes root: grassroots memorials that bloom where institutions fail. Along Mexico's dusty backroads, makeshift shrines to narco saints like Jesus Malva defy both the church and the state. Folk heroes to some, outlaws to others, these unofficial saints are venerated at altars piled with candles and dollar bills, their cults thriving in the gaps between law and survival. These aren't just graves, they're acts of defiance, reclaiming death from the grip of cartels and corruption. Similarly, Berlin's Stolperstein brass cobblestones etched with names of Holocaust victims turn sidewalks into intimate memorials. Unlike towering state-sponsored monuments, these stumblestones force you to look down, to pause mid-step, to confront individual lives erased by genocide. Each one is a guerrilla act of memory, paid for by neighbors and hammered into place without official fanfare. The AIDS quilt transformed cemeteries into canvases for protest. When victims of the epidemic were denied burial rights or relegated to distant plots, activists sewed their names into fabric panels, turning graveyards into sprawling, colorful accusations. These weren't just memorials, they were evidence of neglect stitched together by grief and rage. In Ireland, unbaptized babies once buried in unconsecrated ground now have their own reclaimed spaces, small, tender plots where families leave toys and letters, defying centuries of dogma that labeled these children unworthy of holy soil. These acts don't just honor the dead, they rewrite the rules of who gets remembered and how. Living memorials take this further, replacing tombstones with life itself. In Rwanda, genocide sites are now blanketed in forests, each tree a silent witness to bones beneath the soil. In Louisiana, cypress groves planted over enslaved burial grounds stretch their roots into history, their branches sheltering stories no textbook dares to tell. Even anonymous graves become acts of resistance. In Chile's Patio 29, where Pinochet's regime dumped disappeared prisoners, families still leave fresh flowers on unmarked mounds, turning a wasteland of forgetting into a garden of reckoning. But reclaiming these spaces isn't without legal battles. When Black communities in the American South fight to protect ancestral cemeteries from highway expansions, they're up against zoning laws that prioritize concrete over consecration. In Australia, Aboriginal groups navigate bureaucratic mazes to repatriate stolen remains, often facing museums that cling to academic justifications. The law lags behind the urgency of memory, forcing activists to work in the cracks, planting trees without permits, laying plaques without approval. Yet these subversive acts hold a mirror to power, proving that memory doesn't need marble to endure. Sometimes all it takes is a brass stone underfoot, a quilt in the wind, or a sapling pushing through the dirt whispering that the past won't stay buried. In 1991, construction crews in Lower Manhattan hit more than bedrock, they struck history. As bulldozers dug the foundation for a new federal building, workers uncovered rows of colonial-era coffins, their wood splintered but their occupants unmistakable. These were the forgotten dead of New York's African burial ground, a site where enslaved Africans had been laid to rest 2 centuries earlier. The discovery sparked one of America's most contentious legal battles over who controls the dead. Developers argued the project couldn't be delayed. Activists countered that these weren't just bones, they were ancestors demanding dignity. After years of protests, the government finally halted construction, redesigning the site to include a memorial. The victory set a precedent, proving that even the most powerful entities could be forced to reckon with the past they'd buried. The fight in New York mirrors global struggles over whose laws protect the dead. Egypt's strict antiquities regulations, for instance, declare all pharaonic remains state property, a policy that's clashed with European museums clinging to looted mummies. In contrast, conflict zones like Syria and Iraq see ancient graves bulldozed with impunity, their artifacts funneled into the black market while the world watches. The disparity reveals an uncomfortable truth. Legal protections often depend on who's holding the shovel. Then there's the thornier question of cultural patrimony. When Germany displays Nefertiti's bust in Berlin, or Britain hoards the Rosetta Stone, they're not just showcasing art, they're controlling narratives. Egypt's demands for repatriation aren't about ownership alone. They're about correcting a colonial imbalance where the Global South's heritage became the Global North's trophies. These debates spill into courtrooms worldwide, with judges weighing scientific value against moral restitution. Indigenous communities have scored hard-won victories in this arena. Australia's 1984 Aboriginal Heritage Act handed tribes veto power over excavations, a radical shift from the era when anthropologists treated sacred sites as dig sites. In Canada, the 1996 Supreme Court ruling in the case of the Quede Dentiasinch Shaiman affirmed that Indigenous oral traditions hold equal weight to archaeological evidence when determining burial rites. These legal milestones didn't just return bones to the earth, they restored agency to communities whose voices had been silenced. Now, a new threat looms, one no courtroom can fully contain. Rising sea levels erode coastal burial grounds from Louisiana's Isle de Jean Charles to Scotland's Orkney Islands. Thawing permafrost in Alaska exposes Yupik ancestors to scavengers and decay. In Bangladesh, cyclones scatter bones from centuries-old Muslim cemeteries. Climate change isn't just altering landscapes, it's erasing the very markers of memory, forcing societies to ask, how do you litigate against a warming planet? The answers may lie in blending ancient stewardship with modern innovation. Coastal tribes building artificial reefs to shield submerged graves, or archivists using 3D scans to preserve sites before they vanish. Because the dead have always been more than relics, they're compasses pointing us toward the futures we choose to honor. Off the coast of Ghana, the Atlantic Ocean is swallowing history. Waves gnaw at the shoreline of Fort Prinsenstein, where centuries-old graves of enslaved Africans crumble into the surf. Rusted shackles and fragments of bone wash up between fishing boats, ghosts of the transatlantic trade resurfacing only to vanish again. This isn't erosion, it's an unmarked mass grave dissolving into the sea. Climate change has turned these shores into a battleground between memory and oblivion, with each storm surge carrying away more names, more stories, more proof of a brutal past. Local communities race to document what they can, but how do you preserve a cemetery when the land itself is disappearing? The same crisis echoes in Siberia's melting tundra, where thawing permafrost is cracking open like a fevered mouth. Ancient Norse burial mounds, once frozen in time, now slump into mud, spitting out perfectly preserved Viking artifacts alongside something far darker, plague pits from the 1800s. Scientists in hazmat suits extract fragments of smallpox-infected corpses, racing against time and temperature. The irony is cruel. The very ice that protected these graves for centuries is now failing them, as human-caused warming unleashes pathogens and history simultaneously. For indigenous Nenets herders, the shifting ground isn't just an archaeological crisis, it's a spiritual violation. The earth is coughing up our ancestors, one elder lamented, and we have no place to rebury them. Venice offers a glimpse of what adaptation might look like. At San Michele, the city's island cemetery, marble tombs flood so regularly that caretakers have elevated walkways and installed water pumps between the crypts. But even these measures feel temporary. The famed aqua altar that once lapped at Venetian ankles now submerges entire burial aisles, leaving families to wade through brackish water to reach loved ones' plaques. Preservationists experiment with hydrophobic coatings on stone carvings and AI models to predict tidal surges, but the question remains, at what point does a cemetery stop being a resting place and become a museum exhibit? The bitterest twist lies in who's footing the bill. Oil giants like Shell and Exxon, whose profits accelerated this crisis, now sponsor heritage grants to protect vulnerable sites like Louisiana's Isle de Jean Charles, a Chitimacha burial ground vanishing at one of the fastest rates on Earth. It's a public relations sleight of hand, fossil fuel money building seawalls around cemeteries while their pipelines fracture the wetlands shielding them. Activists call it conscience laundering, a way to monetize grief while avoiding systemic change. Yet some see opportunity in this unraveling. Swedish biotech company Promessa offers ecological freeze-drying burials, turning bodies into compostable powder within weeks. Urban cemeteries in Tokyo stack graves in high-rise columbariums with digital memorial screens, and off the coast of Florida, artificial reef balls embedded with cremated remains double as marine habitats. These innovations aren't just practical, they're philosophical rebellions against the idea that graves must be static. Perhaps the future of remembrance isn't in resisting nature's rhythms, but in redesigning our rituals to flow with them. After all, the sea that claims Ghana's slave graves also carried those ancestors toward new worlds. The permafrost that releases plague bacteria also preserved indigenous stories we'd otherwise have lost. In the end, the dead may have the last word, not as silent monuments, but as collaborators in an ever-changing dialogue between earth and memory. The future of burial is no longer bound by Earth. SpaceX's Elon Musk has floated the idea of Martian cemeteries, where the first settlers could one day rest beneath pink skies, their graves marking humanity's claim to an alien world. It's a sci-fi vision with very real stakes. If Mars becomes a new frontier, will its burial sites repeat the colonial patterns of our past, or will they forge something entirely new? Back on Earth, companies like Celestis are already launching vials of cremated remains into orbit, offering families the chance to turn grief into a celestial event. A single mission can carry thousands of DNA samples, transforming the cosmos into a sprawling, starry necropolis. But these ventures raise uneasy questions. Who regulates space graves? Could a satellite packed with human ashes become orbital debris? The irony is palpable. Even in death, we risk littering the universe. Meanwhile, terrestrial burials are undergoing their own revolution. The mushroom burial suit, woven with mycelium threads that digest toxins and recycle the body into clean compost, turns corpses into catalysts for new life. Sweden's Promessa organic freeze dries bodies with liquid nitrogen, pulverizing them into odorless powder that decomposes within months. These aren't just eco-innovations, they're philosophical rebellions against the notion that graves must be permanent. Dutch designers have even proposed living coffins made of moss, where decomposition fuels plant growth, blurring the line between corpse and ecosystem. Yet for all their idealism, these solutions spark their own conflicts. Religious groups oppose rapid decomposition as disrespectful. Zoning laws struggle to classify human compost as fertilizer. Even in greener graves, politics follows. Digital immortality pushes boundaries further. Startups like Here After AI create chatbots trained on a person's voice and memories, letting loved ones converse with the dead. South Korea's Naver Labs projects holograms of deceased family members at funeral altars, their pixelated smiles eerily lifelike. Cemeteries now offer QR code tombstones linking to video tributes, turning graveyards into augmented reality playgrounds. But beneath the glossy tech lies a thornier truth. These digital afterlives are monetized. Subscription models ensure your hologram grandma doesn't expire, and AI ethics boards warn of emotional manipulation. When a Silicon Valley firm patents an algorithm to simulate your dead loved one's texting style, who owns that digital ghost? The most unsettling twist. These technologies threaten to privatize mourning. Traditional cemeteries were public spaces where grief and memory collided with politics. Think of the AIDS quilt or Vietnam War memorials. But a Mars burial or AI avatar is inherently exclusive, available only to those who can pay. Will future generations mourn through paywalled platforms, their ancestors' stories locked behind corporate servers? Or will they reclaim death as communal ritual, as indigenous groups fighting for green burials have done? The answer may lie in the soil beneath our feet, where mushrooms quietly dissolve the past and new life insists on pushing through. Cemeteries are more than resting places. They're living, breathing reflections of the societies that build them. Every headstone, every mausoleum, every unmarked grave tells a story not just of the dead, but of the living who fought to remember or erase them. From the pyramids of pharaohs to the reclaimed burial grounds of indigenous communities, these spaces are battlegrounds where power, identity, and memory collide. The irony is profound. In our quest to honor the past, we reveal our deepest conflicts, our unspoken fears, and our relentless need to control the narrative of who we are. This isn't just history. The way we bury our dead today, whether in eco-pods or digital cemeteries, shapes the world we leave for tomorrow. When a city bulldozes a historic black graveyard for a highway, or when a government erases mass graves to silence dissent, they're not just rewriting the past. They're dictating whose stories future generations will inherit. But here's the hopeful twist. Cemeteries also hold the seeds of resistance. A single restored headstone, a plaque honoring the forgotten, even a quiet act of tending an ancestor's grave. These small gestures can unravel decades of enforced silence. So here's your challenge. Walk through a local cemetery not as a visitor but as a detective. Trace the names worn smooth by time, the dates that hint at epidemics or wars, the sections where marginalized communities were buried apart. Who's missing, whose stories were never carved in stone? Then go deeper. Research the battles fought over that land, the zoning disputes, the protests, the quiet acts of preservation. You'll quickly see every cemetery is a palimpsest, its layers hiding as much as they reveal. And when you're done, ask yourself this: where should the line between remembrance and politics be drawn? Should governments have the final say over sacred ground? Can a museum ever truly own someone's ancestors? These aren't abstract debates, they're the questions that will define whose voices echo through the centuries to come. Because as the historian once wrote, the dead are never silent. It is we who fail to listen, so listen, and then decide what you'll do with what you hear.